like he's got a Scavenging Ooze in play, a Sylvan Caryatid, and an Elvish Mystic to Michael's board of just lands right now. So this is one of those matchups where Lifebane Zombie from Michael's side of the board can be huge, but obviously it doesn't look like it's really doing, he really doesn't have anything going other than like a handful of removal, and Ross doesn't really have any of his big threats just yet.
And Ross playing a pretty classic early version of Jund Monsters, 4 main deck copies of Reaper of Wilds.
Yeah, and I like that card a lot, particularly in this format, just because it's tough for Esper to kind of interact with it. Plus, the fact that it's black is just huge because it lets it dodge cards like Doomblade. And here comes the Stormbright Dragon, but again, Michael appears to have a Doomblade, so he's able to answer the Stormbright Dragon. But the Scavenging Ooze, that just means the Scavenging Ooze can get bigger now. So another card that we've been hearing a lot of people talk about how much they like in this format is Scavenging Ooze, because with all the removal going around, Scavenging Ooze can get pretty big. Plus, the life gain is not inconsequential.
Yeah, and against the, if you're anticipating people responding to the Rise of Esper with aggressive decks, you can't do a lot better than Scavenging Ooze. Scavenging Ooze is devastating for decks like Mono Red Aggro, Red Green Beatdown, Mono Black. It's a very powerful 2-mana creature.
Yeah, not only that, though, it's actually a pretty good follow-up to Supreme Verdict as well, just because all your creatures in your graveyard might as well make mine bigger. So it looks like Ross has a Reaper of the Wilds. He also has a Dread board to deal with the Desecration Demon. So he doesn't have any mana untapped to protect it from Hexproof, but I don't think he cares at this point. He's going to Scry, and now he's going to attack with Scavenging Ooze, dropping Michael down to 11.
Yeah, I think Ross is pretty, the card he has to be concerned about right now the most is Blood Baron or Obzedat. And if Michael spends his turn removing the Reaper, that's pretty good for Ross. He can continue to attack, grow his Scavenging Ooze, and maybe outpace one of those large creatures. And if Michael does go ahead and play one of the 5-mana creatures, then Ross can untap and protect the Reaper.
Yep. So Michael casts Lifebane Zombie. Lifebane Zombie takes the last card in Ross's hand, which was a Sylvan Caryatid. And Michael only has 1 mana up, so it doesn't like he's going to be able to cast any of his removal spells. I think he has a Devour Flesh in his hand. He also has a lone Elspeth that is just going to be sitting there for a while.
Occasionally, decks like Mono Black and Black-White Midrange get into this board state where they can only cast 1 spell a turn. They have their Heroes Downfalls and Desecration Demons. You can occasionally outpace them. They're leaning on something like Blood Baron or Obzedat or sometimes Grey Merchant in the straight black builds to dig them out of that hole. But once the board state gets like this, often Black-White is not that well equipped to catch up.
Yeah, and speaking of trying to catch up, Ross plays top decks of Corsair Crufix, and he plays it, and he reveals the top card of his library, which is a Domri Rod. So pretty good sequence there for Ross. Michael's going to be hard-pressed to try to come out of this one. Ross attacks with both the Scavenging Ooze and the Reaper of the Wild. Scavenging Ooze can actually grow because there is a Stormbright Dragon still in Ross's graveyard, along with the Desecration Demon in Michael's graveyard.
Yeah, and Domri's also subtly pretty critical for Ross here insofar as with Scavenging Ooze in play, he no longer has to concern himself nearly as much with Blood Baron, as he can make the Ooze a 5/5 with all the stuff that's dying and the creatures that are already in the graveyard, and then use Domri's fight power to make sure that Blood Baron isn't a huge issue.
Exactly. So Elvish Mystic gets tapped for a green, and he's going to remove the Desecration Demon after it gets blocked by Lifebane Zombie to make the Scavenging Ooze a 4/4. So Michael's going to take 4, dropping to 7, and Ross has quite the army in play right now, and he's going to see a Domri Rod next turn. Now, Michael does have an Elspeth in his hand. Unfortunately, he only has 4 mana. He did not draw a land for the turn. He has that Hero's Downfall, and like you said, he's in this position where he has a bunch of removal, but he can only cast 1 spell a turn, and Ross is already so far ahead, and he's continuing to press his advantage, so it's very difficult for the Black-White deck to come out of this situation.
Yeah, again, once you get out in front, they don't have a lot of ways to catch up unless they either have Elspeth or a card like Blood Baron that the opponent randomly can't answer and goes unchecked.
Yes, and Ross Merriam is able to tie up this match at 1-1. And you saw there, Ross has a lot of really good threats in his deck. Even something like Scavenging Ooze, which doesn't seem that impressive early on. It was a 4/4 at the end of the game, and it could have easily been a 6/6 as well. Like you were talking about, it could even kill a Blood Baron. So Ross has a lot of really quality threats here. Let's see if Michael's able to actually contend with all of them. One of the cards that is really important in this matchup for him is Lifebane Zombie, because not only is it able to strip a threat, but it's also a way for him to attack Ross's Planeswalkers.
Yeah, and this is a place where the difference between being on the play and on the draw is also really big. if Ross has a Mana Accelerant on the play, he can deploy something like Palakranos or Reaper of the Wild before Michael has an opportunity to Lifebane it. When Michael is on the play, the reverse is the case. If he makes his land drops, he can Lifebane before Ross gets to deploy one of his 4s. So being on the play or on the draw is a huge deal for Lifebane Zombie.
Yeah, this is one of the situations for black-white is they, like you said, they can usually only cast 1 spell a turn, so they're trying to get in a position where they just have enough parity so that they can kind of get to a position where their late game spells can win the game, either an Elspeth or a Blood Baron or an Obzedat. So being on the draw here is going to be tough for Ross because not only does he have to deal with Lifebane Zombie on the play, but it's going to be hard for him to kind of jump the curve against Michael's deck.
That's why black-white mid-range and mono-black's Devotion's most powerful curve against all, most non-control opponents is removal spell, Desecration Demon. Once you actually are at parity with a large threat in play, you have a lot of very powerful spells to carry the game. You also have a lot of spot removal, so it's hard for your opponent to just kill you by randomly top-decking a threat you don't have an answer to.
Yep.
But until the game gets to that place, you're often just taking lumps and spending your turn, heroes downfalling and devour flushing your opponent. When they're able to deploy multiple threats in front of your ability to remove them, it gets really problematic. You're starting to take all these 4 or 5 damage hits while you're spending your turns just trying to keep your head above water, and that's a place where a deck like Jund Monsters can capitalize on your relative inefficiency.
So looking at his sideboard, Michael's got 3 copies of Sin Collector, 3 copies of Duress, 2 Lifebane Zombie, 1 Revoke Existence, 3 copies of Blood Baron of Viscopa, 2 Doomblade, and 1 Erebos God of the Dead. He does have 1 copy of Blood Baron in his main deck, so he could go up to 4 potentially. But cards that he definitely wants to bring in are the 2 extra copies of Lifebane Zombie and the 2 extra copies of Doomblade, which would bring him up to 4 Lifebane Zombie, and then in his main deck he would have 2 Ultimate Price, 2 Doomblade, 2 Bile-Blight, 4 Heroes Downfall, and 2 Devour Flesh. So a lot of main deck removal after board for him.
It's not even clear if Michael wants Blood Baron in this matchup because he has to respect the possibility of Mizium Mortars in Ross's deck. Generally against green-red strategies, I prefer Obzedat as it's outside of Mizium Mortars range, and depending on the Jund list removal suite, if they're on, say, Mizium Mortars plus Dreadbore, it's actually impossible for them to touch an Obzedat. So even though we've talked a lot about Blood Baron, it's not even clear to me Michael necessarily wants them in this matchup, as if Ross simply has a Mizium Mortars, that could be really brutal for Michael.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's one of those cards. I think the cards that he definitely doesn't want in his main deck are probably Revoke Existence. He can board out one of those. I also don't know how great Bile-Blight is in this matchup. Most of the creatures are out of Bile-Blight range. Obviously, you can kill an Elvish Mystic, but beyond that, there's really nothing else that Bile-Blight hits.
Yeah, I think that the removal spells that you like against a deck like Jund Monsters are the targeted universal ones first, Heroes Downfall, maybe things like Doomblade or Ultimate Price, and then the Edict second. I think the targeted removal that is -X, -X, the Bile-Blights and the Searing Bloods of the world are very difficult to have line up the right way against a deck like Jund Monsters.
I agree. And so what do you see from Ross's side coming in?
He has 2 copies of Ultimate Price, 2 Mizium Mortars, a Dreadbore, 2 Golgari Charms, an Unwrathful the Aether, a Chandra Pyromaster, a Xenagos the Reveler, 2 Rakdos Returns, 2 Mistcutter Hydras, and a Scavenging Ooze. I like bringing in the additional Ooze, the Rakdos Returns, the Xenagos and the Chandra, the additional Planeswalkers, just things that allow him to play a slower, more powerful game.
Yeah, because Michael really doesn't have that many ways to interact with Sylvan Caryatid. So if you can just get to a point where you can Rakdos Return for 3 or 4, all that removal that Michael boards in, it doesn't matter anymore.
It also potentially gives you an out to Elspeth that gets into play. Not the easiest card to answer otherwise, but you can simply Rakdos Return it away along with the rest of Michael's hand.
So it looks like Ross is going to keep his 6-card hand. Michael is going to keep his 7 cards, so we are off. Michael leads with a Godless Shrine into play tapped and passes back to Ross. Ross leads with Stomping Ground.
And I really like Michael's decision here not to Thoughtseize on turn 1, even though he had it in his hand. His life total is at a premium here. It's unlikely that Ross has anything to do on turn 1. It's basically just Elvish Mystic. And so he gets more information on the Thoughtseize. He gives Ross another draw step to find a more powerful tool, and he gets to save himself 2 life points in the balance.
Wow, but Ross reveals a pretty good hand here. He has 2 copies of Domri Rod, Chandra Pyromaster, and 2 Blood Crypts, along with a Dreadbore. So in this situation, I mean, obviously Domri's probably not a great take here. I don't know what else is in Michael's hand, but do you potentially just take the removal spell here?
Well, it depends. If you have a line to open up here, that's one thing, but it's unlikely that the black-white mid-range deck has very much to some start they can get from here to really leverage this opening by taking the removal spell, it's most likely going to be the Planeswalker.
Yeah, this is kind of a dream hand for Ross after board because against a deck with so many targeted removal spells, you really just want a lot of Planeswalkers in this matchup.
Yeah.
So looks like Ross is going to lose one of the Domri rods, but he still has another copy, and as long with Chandra Powermaster. So he has 2 Planeswalkers in his hand along with a removal spell, and it looks like he drew a Courser for the turn.
It's actually a pretty bad draw for Ross. Is now before his hand was not Lifebane zombie proof. That is no longer the case.
Yeah, but knowing that though, do you think Michael goes for the Lifebane here? It looks like he didn't, but he doesn't have a second green anyway, so he might not cast it. Oh, there's an looks like he might have drawn an Overgrown Tomb for the turn. I still think you might lead with the Domri here.
Yeah, well, Michael is representing Hero's Downfall, so you got to pick the threat that you care the least about getting downfalled.
Yeah, not only that, but there's also a Mutavault in play, so Domri would get uptick to 4, probably lose once, but yeah, I agree. It's probably going to just, what do I care about getting downfalled more?
Yeah, the Mutavault definitely changes this. Ross has to value his Planeswalkers a little bit differently.
So Ross is going to lead with the Courser. It could... So he reveals a land off the Courser. So now he has access to double green. He also has the Chandra still in his hand and the Domri, along with a removal spell. And it looks like Michael is going to take out the Courser.
Yeah. Ross, I think, correctly identified the situation there. Knows it's unlikely that either card survives, so just leads with the less powerful one.
So now really can't cast the Planeswalker. He's going to have to just kill the Desecration Demon because it would have any Planeswalker he cast dies to the Desecration Demon anyway.
And that's a big difference between Jund monsters and green-red monsters. Desecration Demon on an open board for the green-red build is very challenging, but for Jund monsters it can be trivial as an ultimate price or dread board simply kills it.
Yeah, so Michael has 5 mana, and it looks like he has a lot of threats in his hand. He's got, I believe, an Obzedat, a Lifebane, and an Elspeth in his hand. So pretty good shape for Michael here. It's exactly the kind of situation you want if you're black-white mid-range. You basically want to just keep making your mana drops, killing everything they have. And Ross is just a little too far behind, I think, to come back from some of those types of threats.
Yeah, this is the big issue with going into the full, I'm going to slow down and play this card advantage game against black-white mid-range. They have so many powerful cards that even if you do successfully land some of your Planeswalkers, that can all be undone by something as simple as Obzedat or Elspeth.
Yeah, so it looks like Michael might have drawn a 6th land. Yeah, it's a Mutavault. So let's see if he wants to lead with Elspeth here. The Elspeth could potentially die to a top deck Stormbreath Dragon. And with the Domri in play, it's not unreasonable. Ross will get 2 basically chances to hit a Stormbreath.
Yep.
And Stormbreath is huge here because Stormbreath could actually just change the entire shape of the game because Michael just has those an Obzedat and a Lifebane in his hand, and those cards don't interact well with Stormbreath. I mean, Stormbreath can still win those races.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of deploying Obzedat here. It's on an empty board. You get to really use the blinking effect here. It's going to pressure Ross's Domri going forward, and it does hedge a lot against Stormbreath Dragon as you get to keep the Elspeth in your hand and simply minus to kill the Stormbreath Dragon if Ross happens to draw it. So,
yeah, I agree. I think your thinking has to be just don't lose to Stormbreath because given his hand, I think this is probably the best line for him.
Yeah.
He knows that there's a Chandra in Ross's hand, so he basically just doesn't want to lose to Stormbreath Dragon this game.
And he also knows, again, like you mentioned, the Chandra here. So having an Obzedat up and running does a lot to contort how Ross has to protect or play with his Planeswalkers. So that's a lot of upside too.
So Ross leads with a Temple of Abandon. Now this makes his next play interesting because he can set up what his top card of his library is going to be. He has a Domri in play, plus he has a Chandra. So he could actually cast Chandra and then play the top card of his library for 0. Looks like he reveals a Scavenging Ooze, so not bad. There's a Desecration Demon in Michael's graveyard plus the Courser and Ross's, so it can be a 4/4.
Yeah, but the big question is, what is Ross's plan long term against Obzedat? This is going to put a ton of pressure on the way he has to play the game.
So Scavenging Ooze comes down here, and it's actually not that bad because Scavenging Ooze can actually grow to at least a 5/5 if Michael decides to attack, because he could just block with this Sylvan Caryatid. And then, so Ross isn't in terrible shape despite the fact that Michael's got some pretty powerful cards in his hand.
Well, the issue here now is that Ross is going to be playing against this Elspeth, which has the ability to simply minus and take care of the Scavenging Ooze.
Yeah, but he would lose his Obzedat as well.
Yes, this is true.
So let's see what Michael decides to do here. He's still got that Elspeth in his hand along with a Blood Baron, but Scavenging Ooze proving to be pretty powerful right here. Michael, let's Let's see what he decides to do here. Oh, it looks like he has a Lifebane zombie. So Obzedat's going to come over. I would be surprised if Ross didn't just chump block with Sylvan Caryatid to give himself another target for Scavenging Ooze.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty high upside chump block here. You get to protect your Planeswalker and get Scavenging Ooze into a place where it could then trade with Obzedat.
Yeah, so looks like that's what he's thinking about. And he hasn't actually used the mana yet, so he's going to tap it for block, tap it for mana, and then activate Scavenging Ooze after damage resolves. So pretty good situation for Ross, despite the fact that he had a slow start and he's contending against an Obzedat, potentially Lifebane's a Blood Baron, along with an Elspeth that we're going to see right here.
Yeah, it's just going to be tough to slog through all of these haymakers. That's the biggest problem that Ross has right now. He has a lot of tools, and there's some good synergies going on, but you're just looking at a lot of very powerful 5 and 6 mana spells being deployed by Michael.
Yeah, well, the good news for Ross is he's able to actually get the Elspeth into play now. So now a top deck Stormbreath Dragon can really kind of help him get this control of this game again. But like you said, he's got to draw it fast because Elspeth is going to get out of control pretty quickly.
Yeah. And this says nothing about what's happening to Ross's life total long-term with this Obzedat coming in and out of play, too.
Oh, so it looks like he drew a Mizzium Mortars. So that's a pretty good draw here. Unfortunately, I don't think he used the mana to grow his Scavenging Ooze last turn, but it doesn't matter. I think he might be off. He could have actually killed Elspeth if he grew the Scavenging Ooze last turn. And now he could overload Mizzium Mortars, but looks like he might be a mana off.
Yeah, and this has all sorts of cascading consequences now as Elspeth gets to activate another time potentially.
Yeah, so it looks like it might have been a slight hiccup for Ross there because I think he did tap the Caryatid for mana. But Chandra does come down here, and since he missed with Domri, it could be a land on top of his deck. But it looks like he's just going to ping. And yep, he's going to ping it and drop Elspeth down to 4. So he still has that Mizzium Mortar, so he still can potentially deal with the Elspeth.
But this is starting to get very challenging for Ross here.
Yeah, I don't think Michael can really attack with Obzedat anymore because I don't think he just wants to get it traded. So he might just be in a game situation where he's going to be blinking it back and forth and just draining Ross for 2 a turn. But still, obviously, it would have been great if Ross could have dealt with the Elspeth that turn.
Yeah, the problem here, of course, is what happens if Michael does a removal spell, too.
Yeah.
Then Ross's House of Cards just collapses.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. Looks like Michael drew a Devour Flesh. Ross doesn't have any other creatures in play to sack, so that Scavenging Ooze will die. Looks like he's going to remove the Sylvan Caryatid to go up to 13, and then he'll gain 5 life to go up to 18.
And between the 2 Mutavaults in play, the Elspeth tokens and the Obzedat, Michael actually has the ability to take down all of Ross's Planeswalkers or simply attack Ross for a lot of damage and set up a lethal Obzedat next turn.
Yeah, so I think I would just go for lethal. I don't even care about the Planeswalkers at this point, especially with the Elspeth in play. You're going to make 3 more tokens. I would just go for it.
Yeah.
But it looks like he is going to go after the Planeswalkers, and Ross still can draw. Well, Stormbreath Dragon probably won't do it now.
Well, Ross knows because there was, he left the card on top with Domri last turn that is probably not a creature, and if it's a spell, then Michael can simply win the game next turn with all these attackers.
Yep. So Ross draws for the turn. He's got that Mizzium Mortars in his hand, so he can deal with the tokens, but he still has to contend with the Elspeth along with the Obzedat.
And the 2 Mutavaults as well. Michael has a lot of pressure.
So, yeah, a lot of pressure on Michael's side of the board, and he's still got that Blood Baron in his hand as well. So Ross just concedes, and Michael Braverman wins 2-1 Black-White mid-range, defeating Jund. And it's kind of played out the way we kind of thought it would, where Michael was on the play, and he was able to just kill everything Ross had. Ross was able